So here's Frege's story about why we need a notion of sense. If you remember, we were asking the question, how can we distinguish the contents of mental states? I believe it's Hendricks. You think, mistakenly, that it's Shields. These are thoughts which differ with respect to their contents. What we've discussed so far is that in order to distinguish the contents of the thoughts, we can't use just the great guitarists themselves. We need something more than that. But what is it? How can we distinguish the contents of these mental states? An answer to this question has been proposed by the great philosopher Frege, and unusually for a philosopher, I think it's generally considered that his view is correct. It's certainly been an incredibly influential view. But before we go further, we have to get something out of the way. Frege, says Dummett, and he knows, Michael Dummett, was at least at the end of his life, a virulent racist and specifically an anti-Semite. I'm not going to read this out, but I encourage you to read it. Steve, why are you mentioning this? I think it's important that we know who we're dealing with. Frege is so influential, there's no way to do philosophy and avoid Frege. Indeed, there's no way to live in the modern world and avoid Frege, because he was largely responsible for the construction of modern logic. But I think it's important that we know who we're dealing with right from the outset. Not a nice person, brilliant philosopher. Now, Frege, thinking about sense and reference once more, was writing before the time of Superman. He had no information about Superman, so he used a different example. In order to introduce the notion of sense, he used the film The Long Kiss Goodnight, the story of that film. It's a very interesting story, so let me introduce you to that without further ado. Main character in the film is Samantha Kane. She's a suburban homemaker and the ideal mum to her 8-year-old daughter Caitlin. She lives in a New England small town, teaches in the local school, and makes the best Rice Krispie treats in town. Key protagonist in the film is Charlie Baltimore. She's a highly trained secret agent and cold-blooded killer involved in the government's most unscrupulous affairs. Now here's something that Frege noticed, something very interesting that Frege noticed. If I were to say to you, Charlie is Charlie, I've said something trivial that you already know, and I haven't ruined your enjoyment of the film. One tiny bit. On the other hand, if I say Charlie is Samantha, I've wrecked the film for you. I'm really sorry about that. I've chosen an obscure film that I think you're most unlikely to want to watch if you haven't seen it already. To be honest, it's not very good. I'm not sure why Frege decided to focus on this one. But anyway, there you go. If I say to you, Charlie is Samantha, I've wrecked the film for you. But not if I say Charlie is Charlie. Why is that interesting? Well, on the face of it, the two things that I have said are in a sense the same, right? We've only got one object here. So when I say Charlie is Samantha, I'm picking out the same object twice. Why is that different from saying Charlie is Charlie? That's what Frege wanted to know. So let's go and put it in Frege's words. Frege says, what is stated in the proposition, Charlie is Samantha, is certainly not the same thing as the content of the proposition, Charlie is Charlie. Okay, interesting. Now here we're talking about propositions. I don't want to break the flow, so what I've done here is I've just postponed discussion about propositions, and for people who want to go and have a look at the unit on propositions, do that now, right? If you're really into this, I think that's very important. At some point, you're going to have to think carefully about what a proposition is, and I do have a section on that. But I think for most people, we just want to not worry about that too much at the moment and get Frege's story fully in place first, and then loop back and do a second, more advanced pass. So my recommendation is that you do need to understand this notion of a proposition. There is some thinking to do here that you probably haven't done yet. It's very unlikely that you've thought carefully about the nature of a proposition, but that we can postpone that for now. Okay, where are we then? What's stated in the proposition Charlie is Samantha is certainly not the same thing as the content of the proposition Charlie is Charlie. Now I'm not sure why we've got contents of propositions coming in here. We can actually strike that out and retain, I think, very good intelligibility. I think that's better. So we've got two propositions and they're different. Okay, not too difficult so far, I hope. Now, if what corresponded to the name Samantha, wrote Frege, as part of the thought was the reference of the name, and hence the woman herself, then this would be the same in both thoughts. Make sense to you? Yeah. If what corresponded to the name in the proposition or the thought was just the reference, namely the woman, then we'd have the same in both propositions, because there is, after all, only one person here. Charlie is, as a matter of fact, Samantha. Now, what's puzzling to me here is that Frege has switched from propositions to thoughts, but it still makes sense if we switch it back again. So let's tidy this up and just think, if what corresponded to the name Samantha as part of the proposition were the woman herself, then we wouldn't have the two propositions being different, but they are different. So what's in the proposition can't be just the woman herself. Here comes Frege again. The proposition expressed in Charlie as Samantha would have to coincide with the one in Charlie is Charlie, which is far from being the case. Brilliant. Okay. Now here, I would like you just to take 90 seconds with your lecture buddy or lecture buddies. Two questions. One is, where have we seen essentially the same point before using a different example? Where have you seen the same point before using a different example? Secondly, is there anything unclear? This is what you're going to be writing on for the seminar, so I think it's really worth taking a moment here to chat with your 90 seconds. Go. Great. So from this point on, I take it that you understand and I understand what Frege is saying here, and we know where we've seen it before. Great. Charlie Baltimore lives in New England, and Samantha Kane lives in New England. These are two different propositions. What Frege says is that someone who takes the latter to be true need not take the former to be true. Why is this relevant? Well, the film features a search for Charlie Baltimore. And indeed, Samantha Kane falls in love with the agent who's seeking out Charlie Baltimore. And the agent seeking Charlie Baltimore knows full well that Samantha Kane lives in New England, after all they're lovers, but continues to search for Charlie Baltimore. But of course, Charlie Baltimore and Samantha Kane are one and the same. So Frege is absolutely right here to point out that someone who takes the latter to be true, Samantha Kane lives in New England, need not take the former to be true. This is something which Samantha Kane herself and the agent looking for Charlie both are in that position. They're both in that position. An object, says Frege, can be determined in different ways. Okay, so now we're actually getting some way towards an attempt at explanation. An object can be determined in different ways. What does he mean by determined? I think he means thought of. So what he's saying is that you can think of Samantha Kane as Samantha Kane or as Charlie Baltimore. And the point of the film is that you have to keep those two distinct ways of thinking about one woman separate. You don't want to conflate those two different ways of thinking about the woman, otherwise you wouldn't be able to follow the film. You must be able to keep those two different ways of thinking about her separate. And every one of those ways of thinking about Samantha Charlie can give rise to a special name. Aha, very good. And those different names have different senses. So here's Frege's idea. Sense is something that we can associate with names, with Samantha and with Charlie. Samantha and Charlie have different names because they're associated with different ways of thinking about the woman even though what they refer to is the same woman. Two different ways of thinking about her, same woman. Frege goes on, for it's not self-evident that the same object which is being... Sorry, I'll say that again. For it is not self-evident that it is the same object which is being thought of in different ways. So here's Frege introducing sense. This is the moment. This is the moment. Sense is a way of thinking about a person. And even though you might have two thoughts about the same thing, if they involve different ways of thinking about that thing, it's intelligible, says Frege, that you might have different attitudes to those thoughts. You might think that the first thought is false, or you might not know that it's true, whereas you know the second thought full well to be true. So this is the idea. Sense is what allows us to make sense of the possibility that although the two propositions at the top here, Charlie Baltimore lives in New England, Samantha Kane lives in New England, they're both propositions about the same person. It's impossible for one to be true and the other false. Nevertheless, someone could know one and fail to know the other. Although they refer to the same thing, they involve different ways of thinking about that thing, or as Frege says, different senses. Now you ask me the question, what are senses? That's a very good question. Stay tuned.